The problem for India is that no matter how much we give to Pakistan, their sole objective is the destruction of India. Their identity is that we are not Indians. That's the only identity. What they are not. They claim they're not Indians. We can even give away Kashmir to Pakistan. I'm not saying we should do that. Hypothetically, if you do that, it's still not going to solve any problems. The only long-term solution from India's perspective is that this territory, which was taken out of India undemocratically without consulting the people of India, the role of the Pakistani army has to be ended. Unfortunately, the Pakistani army is a terrorist force. It's a nuclear armed terrorist force. So India will have to find some way. The Indian leadership over time will have to find some way of liberating the people of present day Pakistan from the terrorist regime of the Pakistan army.
Do you think that because of some of the issues that you've already addressed, like the domestic issues, China peaked demographically, at the very same time, India is obviously still demographically doing very well and has already overtaken China as, as the top demographically speaking country, is projected to become world's economic power number 3, obviously in a direct competition with China again. Do you think that all of these things are not going to result in a more assertive, more nationalistically oriented Chinese foreign and security policy? We've seen already the last episode between China and India along the line of actual control from 2022. And at the same time, China obviously siding with Russia. You said the war is now also kind of quite unpredictable. Obviously, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are certainly not going to give up and are at the same time convinced that they can, still decide the war in the way how they want to shape it. So they want to win. So how do you see India's position in this very fluid, geopolitical environment? India has this difficult, really, really troubled relationship with China, but at the very same time, a very stable relationship with Russia. India has not given up on Russia because of its war against Ukraine. At the same time, is building up on the relationship with the West. I mean, how is India going to navigate in this environment? Are we going to see the new, let's say, non-alignment movement emerging out of this, or are we going to see a kind of for India first kind of policy, so rooting for India first policy in global affairs? What exactly is going to be the positioning of India in this short-term period, in this year, in the next few years to come?
Right. That's a very interesting question. So it's going to be a tightrope walk for India. India is not a massive power yet. India's economic output annually is around 3.5 trillion, which is number 5, I think, in the world. In the next 5 years or so, it will definitely, most likely, become the third largest economy in the world. And yet China is around $15 trillion, which means they're around roughly 5 times that of India's size and strength. And the military strength is proportional to the economic strength, which everyone understands, because military expenditure is a percentage of the GDP. So China overall is about roughly 5 times stronger than India. So it's going to be a tightrope walk for India. This current year, 2023-24, is an extremely crucial, critical year for India, because next year is going to be the election year, the general elections in India. And there's going to be a lot of foreign interest and possibly interference in the electoral process of India, because who comes to power in 24 is going to significantly shape the way the world geopolitics goes. If a weak coalition government comes to power in India in 2024, then it will be significantly more open to external influence and deep pockets of certain nations, which could position India as a counterweight to other nations. So if, let's say, the Chinese Communist Party is able to influence this hypothetical new government, weak government, then they could position possibly India as a counterweight to the West in some ways. If the US is able to influence this hypothetical weak government, then they will be able to position India as a very strong counterweight to China. So it is attractive for China as well as the US to some extent to see a weak government come to power in India in 2024. If a strong government comes to power in India, then the same economic policies and foreign policy will continue, which means that India will have more of an independent foreign policy and more of a what we call neutrality or whatever you want to call it, but it's going to be India centric. So this 1 year which we are staring at, it's going to be extremely crucial. Perhaps if you look at the kind of pressure that China is under right now from the West and from other factors, then maybe they would actually want India to have a strong and more neutral foreign policy, because India does not really threaten China. India does not threaten to liberate Tibet, let's say. India does not make claims on Chinese territory. It's the Chinese who are doing that, claiming Indian territory. So if a strong government comes to power again in 24, it may actually help China and to some small extent perhaps reduce some pressure on China. So maybe China would want Mr. Modi to come back to power. Perhaps for the US, it would make sense for it would be a great hope for them to have a weak government come to power. So that's about the short term. Obviously, India and China have this long-standing border dispute that the Chinese have repeatedly been unwilling to resolve. They have been unwilling to resolve the border issue. It started in the 1950s with the invasion and annexation of Tibet. So China obviously is, like I said, it's no longer going to be the Chinese century, but for the next 20 to 30 years minimum, China is going to be a massively powerful nation and a very influential nation. The decline is going to be very slow and drastic. By the end of the century, it will be visible, but until 2050, I would say China will most likely be a very powerful nation, and India will be ill advised to discount China. So India will have to ensure that it has a credible, let's say, deterrent against China. I'm not talking about the nuclear deterrent, I'm talking about the conventional deterrent. India needs to bolster its armed forces and capabilities, missiles and other things, the Himalayan positions and all that, to send a very clear message to China that you cannot mess with us. It's going to cost you much more than what you can gain. So that is one thing that India has to do, and it's going to be it's a steep task, because China, if it is really under pressure, see, like I said, in Russia, the people are very unforgiving of failure. In China, it's even worse. A leader cannot fail. If you fail, you're done. You finished. You disappear. Mr. Xi Jinping obviously is acutely cognizant of that. He has ascended through the extremely tough ladder in the Chinese Communist Party, so he knows how it is. So if he feels that he is under threat from the US, and obviously the recent coronavirus, the way they handled the coronavirus pandemic, those extremely harsh lockdowns for months and all, it has really demoralized the Chinese populace to some extent. It is one of the major causes for the TFR, total fertility rate, to go down. And the main pressure that Mr. Xi Jinping could feel could be from within, because the leader must be seen to succeed. And if things are going bad, then he may need to look for an external win, maybe a short sharp war and a victory, to reassure the Chinese people that everything is under control. So that is one thing that India has to always keep in mind, that the Chinese may be tempted, if they feel India is weak or has taken its eyes off the ball, then they may be tempted to perhaps indulge in some military adventure or misadventure along the Indian border, maybe along the Siliguri corridor, or maybe Arunachal Pradesh or somewhere. So that is something obviously the Indian government will have in mind. So China is a major threat for India. That's something India will have to do. The other thing is that the West also does not really, the US plans long, just like China, and the US also does not want to see the emergence of a new competitor 20 or 30 years down the line. So they will also want to, one could say, moderate the rise of India. They do not want India to rise too much. They don't want India to become too weak, because then it will become useless against China, but they don't want India to become too strong either. So there's a kind of balancing act that we will see. And for instance, let's take the US attitude or policy towards India. For 26 plus months, there was no American ambassador to India, despite India being one of the major nations, most important nations in the world. And now they're appointing Mr. Eric Garcetti as the ambassador to India, a person who has zero diplomatic experience. So that is kind of, it's like India appointing, let's say, Shah Rukh Khan or some actor as the ambassador to the US, person with zero diplomatic experience. So either the US is completely clueless, or it knows what it's doing. So I am of the opinion that Mr. Garcetti, even though he has no diplomatic experience, he is like Liam Neeson in Taken. He has a very specific set of skills, and those skills may most likely be deployed in India in this year 2023, and perhaps try to shape the way the electoral campaign and all that goes. So that is something the US is definitely inclined towards. And even before he came to India, he has spoken about human rights and all the same old tropes that the US loves to repeat. Uh, so yes, it's going to be a tough climb for India. If so, what's imperative for India is that somehow or the other, India needs to ensure at least 1 decade of peace, which means no major military conflict with anybody, and focus on the economy. If India does that, it's going to become the third largest economy in the world. By 2035, it's going to cross $10 trillion of economy. And once you cross that threshold, it doesn't make sense for anybody to try and tangle with you. And of course, India is not a threat to anybody. India has never been a hegemonic, expansionist, imperialistic power. So India's rise, as it happens, will most likely be welcomed by the global south, and it will not even be a threat to China or, let's say, Iran. Pakistan is a temporary nation, like I keep saying. It is a leftover issue of history. It is always on the brink of collapse now more than anything else. So I don't think India needs to worry about Pakistan. Pakistan is a non-issue. Pakistan is merely a proxy of other external forces. For some time, for a significant time, it was the proxy of the US. For a brief period of time, a decade or so, it was a proxy of China. Now it is back in the US camp. So that's something it keeps vacillating towards, but it's overall not a big issue for India. So India needs to ensure at least a decade, ideally 2 decades, of no war with anybody, no major military conflict, and focus on the economy. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be pressure from multiple sides. Nobody wants to see India rise, obviously, because it is going to be counterproductive to other established powers. So it's going to be a very delicate tightrope walk, and that's what the Indian government is currently doing. Dr. Jaishankar obviously has been representing India admirably, and what we call the Jaishankar policy is essentially, or actually, the Modi doctrine. It is Mr. Modi's foreign policy that Dr. Jaishankar is implementing. So that's what we are seeing. So it's going to be difficult for India, but it's something that can definitely happen. In this century, if any nation can surpass the US as the biggest economic power, it's only India. China is no longer projected to do that. Its economy is no longer growing the way they would have wanted it to grow. There are so many issues, so much pressure. The manufacturing output is dropping, the economy, the GDP is shrinking. Major nations are looking to shift their manufacturing out of China. That's happening. The semiconductor issue is there, and obviously the TFR is dropping. It's below 1.2 or 1.1 total fertility rate, which is a catastrophe for any nation. So China is trying to rely on artificial intelligence and robotics to alleviate this issue, but robots cannot consume, and for any economy to grow, you need consumption. So it's going to be tough for China. It's also going to be tough for India. And if China feels too much of a squeeze, you could actually have a Chinese desire to go to war with India to alleviate the internal pressures. So yeah, that's the scenario where we are at. Obviously, India's major number one threat is always going to be China, as long as Tibet is under Chinese control, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future.
But maybe just to address one issue, would you agree that then normalization of at least trade relations with Pakistan would make perfect sense from India's point of view, at least in this decade, to really stabilize the situation and to have also alternative transport or trade corridors, given the situation of encirclement coming from China? I mean, this string of pearls that China was applying on India by engaging with the smaller neighbors. And given the precarious situation of Pakistan, I mean, India obviously doesn't need a failed state from a geopolitical point of view next to its border, because we know that this creates a security vacuum. It leads to more, let's say, terrorist activities and all of these kind of negative effects that are not going to be in India's interest.
Right. So Pakistan is a very interesting neighbor for India, and we understand Pakistan very well. Pakistan is the evil us. I mean, they are the same people as us. We have the same history. So the issue with Pakistan is not the people. We have absolutely no enmity with the people of Pakistan. The issue is not the terrorists. The terrorists are not some non-state actors. The terrorists are an outgrowth of the military intelligence establishment. The issue is that for most nations, the nation has an army. In the case of Pakistan, the army has a nation. They own the entire nation and they control everything within. So, whatever issues exist between India and Pakistan, they are essentially caused by the Pakistan army. The Pakistan army keeps on creating this specter that India is the eternal enemy, and as long as India exists, the Pakistan army is needed to keep Pakistan safe. That is not true. So the issue is the Pakistan military, and the military obviously it depends on external forces for help. Let me see. I'm not a diplomat, so I can afford to be a little blunt and transparent. So for decades, the Pakistani terrorism in India was funded and financed by the United States from the 1980s onwards, and at least until 2008. After that, the Indian attitude changed, especially after Mr. Modi came to power. India struck back at Pakistan multiple times in a manner that made it very clear to Pakistan that you cannot afford to keep on doing terrorism against India. It's going to cost you much more than what you will gain. So now the terrorism has essentially dropped off, except for some sporadic incidents here or there. So the problem for India is that no matter how much we give to Pakistan, their sole objective is the destruction of India. This is very clear. You can read any Pakistani army publication, their politicians, what they say. They have only one agenda. Their identity is that we are not Indians. That's the only identity. What they are not. They claim they're not Indians. So even if India gives away, let's say, Kashmir to Pakistan, it's not going to solve the problem. They are going to keep on having the same attitude. The only objective is the destruction of India. So as long as this nation exists, at best inheritant and at worst an existential threat for India. So we can do trade with Pakistan. It's not going to solve any problems. We can even give away Kashmir to Pakistan. I'm not saying we should do that. Hypothetically, if you do that, it's still not going to solve any problems. The only long-term solution from India's perspective is that this territory, which was taken out of India undemocratically without consulting the people of India, the role of the Pakistani army has to be ended. Unfortunately, the Pakistani army is a terrorist force. It's a nuclear armed terrorist force. So India will have to find some way. The Indian leadership over time will have to find some way of liberating the people of present day Pakistan from the terrorist regime of the Pakistan army. So ideally, we would want. See, there are lots of freedom movements happening in Pakistan. The people of Balochistan desperately want freedom. This region was annexed illegally by Pakistan in 1948 through military force. The people of Sindh have been struggling for independence, the Sindhu Desh movement, for a long time. The Pashtun people of the northwest frontier province, they are Pashtuns. They want to reintegrate the region with Afghanistan, Pashtunistan, and so on. And the people of Gilgit, Baltistan, and Pakistan occupied Kashmir, they have been protesting and demonstrating for reintegration with the rest of Kashmir, because the rest of Kashmir is progressing immensely and there's nothing there. So, from my perspective, obviously, I am not affiliated with the Indian government. I don't represent their public stand. But from my perspective, the only long term solution is to essentially end the influence of the Pakistan army and let Pakistan be balkanized peacefully without any violence. Let the people gain their freedom aspirations and all that, and then the issue will be solved. The people are not the problem. The Pakistani people are the same as the people of India. It is the army that has been acting as a mercenary force on behalf of outside forces. So whether we normalize trade relations or whatever, it's not going to give access to India, to Afghanistan via the Wakhan corridor or whatever. The Pakistanis, no matter what we do, will not give India access to Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan need access to India because it will really release so much of the pressure they are feeling. India and the Taliban government are cooperating beautifully. There is no issue. Pakistan is the issue. So I don't see a normalization of trade relations doing any good to the issue that we are facing. Pakistan, unfortunately, the Pakistan army has to go, and that's a long-term solution, not a short-term solution.